The memo was in a banker's box labeled Foundation Legal Archive 2016-2017. One of 40 boxes I'd been given full authorized access to because the Whitfield Family Foundation was 3 weeks from closing a merger with a larger charitable trust, and I was the outside counsel running the compliance review. I wasn't looking for anything about myself. I was looking for old grant agreements. The memo was one page, dated the second week of March, addressed to the family's estate attorney. Subject line, Managing the Amara Situation, Long-Term Considerations. My name. My engagement to Marcus had been announced 11 days earlier. I read it standing in a windowless records room with a banker's box open on the table in front of me, and I read it twice before my hands understood they were supposed to be shaking. It laid out in careful, lawyerly language that I recognize because it's the same register I use myself for a living, a plan to keep my name off official foundation materials during the initial transition period, to delay any board seat discussion until the family has had time to assess public reception, and to review the language of the family trust so that any future provision naming Marcus's spouse reflects appropriate discretion given our donor relationships. I have read 100 memos like this in my career. I have never read one with my own name in the subject line before I'd even picked out my wedding dress. My mother-in-law's initials were at the bottom. E.W. Eleanor Whitfield. I set the page down on top of the box, squared the corners the way I square every document I've ever handled professionally, in a life spent training myself to look unbothered in rooms that were not built for me. Then I photographed both sides with my phone, replaced it exactly where I'd found it, and closed the box. 11 days after my engagement was announced, 8 years before I was standing in that records room as the attorney the family needed to save their foundation. I did the math without meaning to, how long she had been managing me, quietly, on paper, before I ever sat across from her at a single family dinner and thanked her for having me. I put the memo back and finished the rest of that day's review the way I finish everything, methodically, on schedule, because I had a merger deadline and 40 more boxes to get through, and no room yet to feel whatever I was going to feel about this. I remember driving home that evening and pulling into my own driveway and sitting there for a full minute before I could make myself go inside, because Marcus was going to ask how the audit was going, the way he asked every night, and I was going to have to answer him normally, in a voice that gave nothing away, before I'd even decided what any of it meant.
My name is Amara Bankole. I go by Bankole professionally and Whitfield everywhere else. A small division I'd never examined closely until the day it started to feel less like convenience and more like a door I'd been quietly kept on one side of. I was 36 that spring, a senior associate on partner track at a mid-sized corporate firm in Boston, and I had spent 14 years building a career out of being the most prepared person in every room I walked into, because I learned early that preparation was the only currency nobody could argue with. I met Marcus Whitfield in law school, back when he was still deciding whether he wanted to practice or run his family's foundation full-time. He chose the foundation, I chose the firm. We built a marriage the way you build anything durable, slowly, with attention, checking the joints. I didn't marry into the Whitfield family blind to who they were. Old Boston money, 4 generations deep, a foundation with real influence in the city's philanthropic circles. I'd done my homework, the way I do homework on everything, and what I found looked, on paper, like a family that valued exactly the things I valued: education, discretion, doing good work quietly instead of loudly. I trusted that read because I'd earned the instinct that produced it, over a career built on reading rooms accurately. Here's the vulnerability I'll admit to. I have spent my whole adult life being the only Black woman in rooms full of people who assumed I'd gotten there some way other than the work, and I learned to armor against that by being flawless, unimpeachable, twice as documented as everyone around me. It made me an excellent attorney, It also meant for years, when Eleanor's comments landed slightly wrong, I filed them under misunderstanding instead of pattern, because admitting pattern meant admitting I hadn't read this room as accurately as I thought I had. Marcus and I built a home outside the city, and most Sundays I make a pot of jollof rice the way my mother taught me, the smell filling the whole downstairs before anyone's awake. That kitchen is where I would eventually lay out for Marcus everything I'd found. The same kitchen where I'd once nervously rehearsed what to call his mother the first time we met. I want to be honest. For most of those 8 years, I liked Eleanor. Genuinely. She remembered my father's health scare and sent flowers before I'd told most of my own friends. She could be funny in a dry, understated way that caught me off guard the first few times. None of what I found later erased those moments. And I think that's part of what made everything so disorienting once I did find it. I wasn't uncovering a woman I'd always secretly distrusted. I was uncovering a second version of someone I had, in good faith, let myself love.
Eleanor Whitfield was born into a family that had already lost, once, the thing she spent the rest of her life protecting. Her father, my husband's great-grandfather by marriage, was at the center of a financial scandal in 1974 that got the family quietly dropped from the city's oldest social clubs and whispered about at every gathering Eleanor attended as a teenager. She has told this story to me exactly once, at a holiday dinner years ago, in a tone flatter than the story deserved. How her mother stopped being invited anywhere for almost 2 years, how Eleanor learned to read a room for danger before she learned algebra, how the family spent the next 3 decades rebuilding a reputation one perfectly managed gala at a time. By the time I met her, Eleanor had spent 40 years turning the Whitfield Family Foundation into the instrument of that rebuilding. Every event curated, every photograph considered, every donor relationship managed like a garden that could be lost to one bad season if she looked away. I understand now that when she looked at me, she wasn't only seeing her son's fiancé, she was seeing a variable she hadn't budgeted for in a system she had spent her whole life engineering against exactly the kind of scrutiny she believed a Black daughter-in-law would invite from the donor base she'd spent decades cultivating. I am not writing this to excuse what she did. I'm writing it because I think it's the only way to understand how a woman capable of real warmth, and she is, I've seen it, with her grandchildren, with old friends, could sit down and draft a memo managing my visibility before she'd spent a single unsupervised hour with me. She was not a woman who hated me personally, at least not at first. She was a woman who had built her entire identity around never again being the family people talked about, and who decided, quietly and without consulting anyone, that I was a risk to that project worth managing rather than a person worth actually meeting. I think about her mother sometimes, a woman I never met, standing at the edge of some Boston ballroom in 1975, while people who used to return her calls stopped returning them. I think about the teenager Eleanor must have been, watching that happen and deciding, in whatever private way children decide these enormous things, that she would spend her whole adult life making sure it never happened to her again, whatever the cost, to whoever ended up standing in the way of that promise. That doesn't make what she did to me acceptable. It makes it explicable, which is a smaller and much colder kind of understanding than forgiveness. Looking back, there were 6 moments across almost 5 years that I filed away separately, each one small enough to explain on its own. The first was our engagement dinner, when Eleanor introduced me to her closest friends as Marcus's very accomplished fiancé, 3 times without once using my name, and I told myself she simply forgot because people forget things at parties. The second was the foundation's spring gala the following year, when the seating chart placed Marcus at the head table with the major donors and placed me 2 tables back next to the caterer's coordinator. Eleanor said the head table was already so full that year, and I believed her because head tables do fill up. The third was a comment at a family barbecue about how articulate I'd been in a toast I gave, delivered with such warm sincerity that I laughed along before I understood hours later what the compliment had actually implied about her expectations going in. The fourth was Eleanor's repeated cheerful mispronunciation of my maiden name at foundation events, even after I corrected her 4 separate times across 2 years, always followed by, "I'll get it eventually," which she never did, in front of donors who then felt permitted to get it wrong too. The fifth was being quietly left off the foundation's holiday card 3 years running while Marcus's sister's new husband, who'd married in the year after me, appeared in his first year. The sixth was smaller and sat with me longest. Eleanor's assistant began routing meeting invitations to Marcus alone for planning conversations I had specific legal expertise to contribute to, always with some version of, "didn't want to take up your time." Each one had an explanation I could hold separately from the others. Together, I wasn't ready to hold them together yet, because together meant asking a question about my own mother-in-law that I didn't yet have language for. I've gone back through those years more times than I'd like to admit, looking for the moment a reasonable person would have said something out loud. I don't think there was one clean moment. I think there were 6 small ones, each easy enough to explain by itself, and a version of me who had spent her whole life being told, implicitly, that raising a concern about race without airtight proof made you the problem in the room rather than the person who'd noticed one. That caution had protected me in 100 professional settings. At my own family's table, it just meant the pattern had years longer to run before I let myself name it. And years is a generous way of putting what it actually cost me to stay quiet that long. The pattern stopped being 6 separate moments and became one shape on a Tuesday almost 3 years before I found the memo, the same week the foundation announced its largest single gift in a decade. I'd been asked, informally, to review a grant agreement for the foundation as a favor. The kind of favor Eleanor had never once asked of me before, despite my exact professional expertise sitting unused at every family gathering for years. I did the work well, carefully, the way I do everything, and the agreement closed clean. 2 weeks later, the foundation's newsletter profiled the family team behind the gift. Marcus was named. His sister was named. I wasn't mentioned once, despite having drafted the language that got the deal closed. I didn't say anything to Eleanor. What I did instead was open a plain document on my personal laptop, one nobody else had access to, and start writing dates down. The gala seating, the newsletter, the holiday card, going back as far as I could reconstruct with any accuracy. I labeled the file Foundation Notes because if anyone ever glanced at my screen, I wanted it to look exactly like the kind of boring professional tracking I do for actual clients. Item 1 went into that file that Tuesday. 8 years of foundation involvement, 1 professional credit, 0 public acknowledgement despite documented contribution. I told myself I was simply keeping good records, the way any careful professional does. I told myself this often enough that spring that I nearly believed the file was about my career and not about my mother-in-law. But I knew even then that I wasn't building a record for a resume. I was building a record for a version of myself a few years down the line who might need to prove to someone that I hadn't imagined a pattern I'd spent years being told gently by everyone around me, including myself, that I was reading wrong. I kept that file updated maybe once a season after that, always in the same flat administrative language I use for actual clients. Never a single sentence about how any of it made me feel. I think, looking back, that was its own kind of survival. If the files stayed boring, I could keep telling myself I was simply a thorough professional keeping good notes, rather than a woman quietly building a case against her own family. I never once showed it to Marcus during those years, not because I doubted him, but because I hadn't yet decided what I would do with it, and some part of me wasn't ready to make him choose a side before I understood the full shape of what he'd be choosing between. I told myself I was protecting him. Looking back, I think I was also protecting myself from watching him not know what to do with it. The memo in the records room was the moment the pattern I'd been quietly logging stopped being something I was managing internally and became a fact I could no longer file under misunderstanding. Once I had it photographed, I spent the following 6 days doing what I do best: methodical work nobody sees. I cross-referenced the memo's date against the Foundation Notes file I'd kept for almost 3 years. I found the estate attorney's reply 3 pages further into the same box, confirming the trust language had in fact been revised that spring. The provision that would have named any future spouse of Marcus's as co-beneficiary was quietly narrowed to name only lineal descendants and their spouses of record as approved by the Foundation Board. A clause that gave Eleanor, as board chair, direct discretion over whether I would ever be formally recognized at all. I found this on a Thursday afternoon, alone, in the records room after the building had mostly emptied, the smell of old paper and cold coffee thick in a space with no windows. I sat completely still for longer than I could account for afterward, not counting anything, yet just sitting with a single page in front of me that rewrote 8 years of my own marriage into something I hadn't known I was living inside. Then my body caught up to what my mind had already understood. My hands went cold, then my forearms, a specific hollow pressure settling under my ribs that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. I pressed both palms flat against the table because I needed something solid under them. I didn't cry. I want to say that plainly because I think people expect this moment to look like tears, and mine didn't. Mine looked like stillness and cold hands, and a woman who had spent her whole career being unshakable, sitting very still in a windowless room, doing math she wished so badly she'd never had reason to learn. I decided, sitting there, not to say a word to Marcus that night. Not because I doubted what I'd found, because I understood that the moment his family knew I'd seen this, whatever else remained in those boxes would disappear before I finished the audit I'd been hired to run. I drove home that night the long way, past the exit I usually took, because I needed the extra 15 minutes to arrange my face into something that could survive Marcus asking over dinner how the archive review was going. I told him it was tedious, dry, mostly grant agreements and old fundraising letters. That part, at least, wasn't a lie, even if it wasn't close to the whole truth. I decided that night, driving home with the radio off because I couldn't stand the sound of anything cheerful, that silence would cost me more than confrontation would have. And I chose it anyway because confrontation would have cost me the rest of the archive. What nobody tells you about performing normalcy inside your own marriage is how much of your body it requires. Not just your face, though, God, the face is the hardest part. Smiling through a Sunday dinner at Eleanor's table, passing the serving dish without my hand shaking, laughing at Marcus's father's jokes the way I always had, while some new, unfamiliar part of me wanted to flinch away from a woman I'd spent 8 years calling family. I stopped sleeping through most nights that followed. I'd lie awake at 2, 3 in the morning next to Marcus, listening to him breathe easily, a man with no idea his mother had spent a decade quietly managing his marriage on paper, and I'd think, how do I tell you this without it becoming somehow my fault to manage too? I told exactly one person during those weeks, Marcus's older sister, Beatrice, because I needed one human being who knew what I was carrying so I wouldn't lose my mind carrying it alone. Beatrice didn't ask if I was sure or whether I had somehow misread things. She said, "Show me." And when I did, she went quiet for a long moment and then said, "I believe you completely," before adding, almost to herself, "She did something like this to my ex-husband too, and I let myself not really look at it." I didn't know yet how much I'd need that sentence in the weeks ahead. The hardest part wasn't the fear of being wrong. I had a memo, a revised trust clause, and 3 years of documented pattern. I wasn't wrong. The hardest part was the specific grinding loneliness of sitting at family dinners loving people who had no idea what I now knew while quietly finishing the case that would eventually make that ignorance impossible for any of them to keep. There were evenings I sat in my car in our own driveway for 10 minutes before going inside, not crying, just sitting, because the car was the one place I didn't have to arrange my face into anything for anyone. Then I'd go in and help Marcus with dinner like nothing had happened, because in his version of that evening, nothing had, and I hadn't yet decided when or whether his version was going to have to change. I loved him the entire time I was deciding that. I want that on the record too, because it would be easier to tell this story as though love and calculation lived in separate rooms of the same house, and they never once did. I didn't do anything reckless. Everything that followed depended on doing this the methodical way, using the exact authorization I'd already been given rather than the satisfying one. As lead compliance counsel on the merger, I had full legal access to the Foundation's records going back 15 years, a scope of review nobody could question because I'd been hired specifically to question everything in those boxes. I requested the complete board minutes archive next, going back to the year Marcus and I got engaged, something well within my mandate and nothing that would raise a flag with anyone watching. That gave me item 2, board minutes from the meeting immediately after the engagement announcement, showing a closed session item labeled only Family Composition Governance Review, with no further detail in the public minutes, but a line item in the Foundation's legal budget that same quarter for outside counsel trust language revision. I brought in a colleague from outside my own firm to formally review the trust revision itself, a trusts and estate specialist named Priya Advani, someone who'd never met a Whitfield in her life and had no reason to see this as anything but a technical document. She confirmed within days what I already suspected. The clause was drafted specifically, deliberately, not as routine housekeeping, but as a targeted narrowing designed to require board approval for exactly one category of person entering the family, a spouse without existing family lineage. I found the trigger myself going back through the Foundation's own donor correspondence. The clause had been drafted in the exact quarter the Foundation was courting its largest donor family to date, a family whose matriarch had, in an earlier unrelated fundraising letter I found in the same archive, expressed concern about the Foundation maintaining its traditional character as it grew. Eleanor wasn't reacting to me in isolation. She was reacting to what she believed I represented to a donor she was afraid of losing. That was item 3, a governance change, a donor courtship, and a timeline that lined up too precisely to be a coincidence. I had proof now. I still didn't have the full why or how far the pattern actually reached. Priya never asked me a single personal question through any of it, and I was grateful for that at the time, and even more grateful for it later. She treated the clause like a technical drafting problem with an identifiable intent behind it. Nothing more, nothing less. And there was something almost restful about that flat procedural framing while everything else in my life had turned emotional and complicated. I paid her out of my own account, quietly, because by then I understood that gathering proof of a pattern like this required leaving as small a footprint as the pattern itself had. There's a version of this story where I tell you the investigation was the hardest part. It wasn't. The hardest part was a Sunday evening 6 weeks in when Eleanor called unexpectedly to thank me for a legal memo I'd written years earlier that had apparently just saved the foundation from a compliance headache during merger due diligence, and said warmly, "I don't know what we'd do without you looking out for this family. I mean that, Amara." I sat there on the phone with a woman who had spent a decade quietly narrowing my place in that same family, and I let the warmth in her voice land because it was real. Eleanor's gratitude that evening wasn't performance, I believe that. And it existed in the exact same breath as a governance clause sitting in a folder 11 feet from me, revised specifically to require her personal approval before I could ever be formally recognized as more than an unofficial addition. I didn't sleep that night either, not from anger, from the specific vertigo of being genuinely valued and quietly managed by the same person, in the same relationship, sometimes in the same conversation. I told Beatrice about that call because I needed to say it out loud to someone who wouldn't tell me I was overreacting to a compliment. She didn't. She said, "You're allowed to know she cares about you and know what she did at the same time. Both things happened." I spent years pretending they couldn't both be true about my own marriage, and it cost me understanding what was actually happening until it was already over. I wrote that down. I still have it. What it cost me across those months wasn't only sleep or peace, it was the specific loneliness of being the only person at every family dinner who understood what the family actually was. I was grieving a version of belonging I genuinely believed in while still setting the table for it every Sunday because I hadn't finished proving what I already knew to be true. Some evenings I'd catch myself enjoying Eleanor's company, genuinely, before I remembered, and the remembering felt like missing a stare in the dark. I don't know how to explain that to anyone who hasn't lived it, that the warmth wasn't a performance I was tolerating. It was real, standing on ground I already knew was going to give out from under both of us eventually, and knowing that didn't make the ground feel any less solid while I was still standing on it. I've stopped trying to decide which version of that call was the truer one. I think they both were, at the exact same time, and I think that's simply what it costs to love someone who is capable of both. The reframe came from someone who had no obligation to tell me anything at all. Denise Okafor had worked as the Foundation's communications director for 11 years before retiring the year I married Marcus, and I found her name in old newsletter bylines while tracing exactly when I'd stopped appearing in Foundation materials. I called her on instinct, expecting a polite, guarded conversation with someone still loyal to a family she worked for over a decade. She remembered me. When I told her, carefully, that I'd found some irregularities in old Foundation governance records involving family composition, she was quiet for a moment before she said, "Does the name Robert Ansa mean anything to you?" It didn't. Not yet. By the end of that call, it did. Robert Ansa had been Beatrice's first husband, 12 years before me, a black surgeon Beatrice had married young before her first divorce, and Denise had drafted, at Eleanor's direct request, nearly identical language for a different Foundation document during that marriage. Language limiting spousal visibility in materials, delaying formal board recognition, timed to a different major donor courtship that decade. "She didn't build this because of you specifically," Denise told me. "I watched her build the exact same thing once before for the exact same reason against a different man. I should have said something back then. I'm sorry nobody did." Item 4 went into my file that night. A prior, structurally identical governance pattern deployed against a different black spouse more than a decade before I ever met this family. This changed everything about what I understood I was dealing with. This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment from an otherwise fair woman startled by an unfamiliar situation. This was a method Eleanor had built once already, refined the second time with cleaner legal language and less resistance, and I had married into a family already running it before I ever sat down for my first dinner at that table. I asked Denise before we hung up why she was telling me any of this now, so many years after choosing not to say anything about Robert at the time. She was quiet for a second, then said she'd always wondered whether staying silent the first time had made it easier for Eleanor to do it again to someone else. I thanked her. I didn't tell her it had taken me 4 months of records and a trust attorney to reach the same door she'd handed me in a single phone call, or that I'd spent most of that call trying to keep my voice as flat and professional as hers for exactly the same reason she'd probably kept hers that way for 11 years working in that building.
I didn't confront Eleanor to ask her why. I already had a why, and it didn't require her confirmation to be true. I understood it the moment I let Denise's call sit next to the story Eleanor had told me once in that flat, careful voice about her own mother being quietly dropped from every guest list in Boston. Eleanor wasn't managing me or Robert before me to be cruel for its own sake. She was managing a terror that had defined her entire adult life. That the family could lose everything again publicly, the way it had once before, if the wrong variable entered the equation in the wrong moment in front of the wrong donor. She had decided somewhere along the way that Black spouses were precisely that variable, a risk to be engineered around rather than people to actually know. And she had built 2 separate, decade-apart systems to do exactly that engineering, quietly enough that no one, including her own children, would ever have to call it what it was. Understanding this didn't soften what it cost. I want to be precise about that because I think stories like this can slide into forgiveness disguised as insight, and I'm not offering that here. Knowing why someone built a wall doesn't make it hurt less to discover you were being quietly measured against it for 8 years. Eleanor's fear was real. My 8 years of good faith were also real. Only one of us had been honest about what those years actually contained. What the full picture gave me wasn't peace, it gave me precision. I stopped asking myself, in the weeks before I finally brought this forward, whether I'd been too sensitive, too quick to read a pattern into ordinary family awkwardness. I hadn't caused a 1974 scandal I wasn't alive for, and I hadn't caused a woman to decide, twice now, across 2 marriages in her family, that respectability required managing exactly which spouses got to exist in full view. Beatrice, when I told her about Robert, was quiet and then said, "She's been protecting this family from being talked about since she was a teenager. She just never noticed she'd become the thing worth talking about." I didn't correct her. She'd already started building her own case quietly about what her mother's pattern meant for her own daughter, who was mixed race and would grow up in the same family. I stopped around then, expecting the full picture to feel like an ending. It didn't. It felt more like finally holding the right map for a road I'd already been walking blind for years. The destination hadn't changed, but I understood, finally, why every turn had felt the way it did, and I could stop wondering whether I'd been the one misreading the terrain the whole time. I chose the final foundation board meeting before the merger vote, because that room was built for exactly this kind of decision, and I wanted the record made in the place designed to hold it. I brought one folder. Inside it, the original memo, photographed and now formally logged as part of the compliance audit, the revised trust clause alongside the estate attorney's confirming correspondence,
Priya's technical analysis of the language's targeted design, and a summary memo, unsigned by name to protect her, of the earlier pattern involving Robert Ansa, dates matched against the Foundation's own newsletter archive. 4 items, numbered exactly as they'd gone into my file over 4 months. Eleanor had her own materials on the table that morning, too, though she didn't know yet that mine existed. The merger presentation she'd spent weeks preparing, the Foundation's polished legacy narrative for the new donor family, laid out in careful, practiced language. Her folder, my folder, 6 inches apart on a conference table in the building her family's name was on. I opened mine as the required compliance disclosure and said one thing. This governance clause was drafted 11 days after my engagement was announced and narrows recognition specifically for spouses without existing family lineage. I'm required to disclose it as part of this merger's legal review. I didn't ask her to explain. I laid the 4 items, in order, on the record, in front of the full board, including Marcus's father. And then I closed my folder, gathered my materials, and stated that I would need to recuse myself from any further discussion involving family governance matters, given the personal conflict this created. The room went quiet for exactly 9 seconds. I counted, because counting was the only thing left that felt steady under my hands. Then I heard Marcus's father say Eleanor's name once, low, in a tone I had never once heard him use with her in 8 years. I didn't look at Eleanor as I left. Not because I wasn't afraid or angry or somewhere underneath both still grieving something I hadn't finished grieving yet. I didn't look at her because I had decided weeks earlier that the only power available to me in that room was refusing to witness whatever reflexive, unexamined thing came out of her in the first 60 seconds after being seen. I sat in my car in the parking garage for several minutes before I could make myself pull out, hands steadier on the wheel than I expected given what had just happened. Then I drove to Beatrice's and let myself finally shake somewhere between the garage exit and the first red light, where nobody I loved could see it happen. Eleanor called 4 times before I reached Beatrice's house that afternoon. I didn't answer, but I read every message because I needed to understand what strategy she'd settle on once the shock wore off. The first messages weren't confession. They were context. The clause was standard governance language. She'd meant to revisit it years ago. The timing looked worse out of context than it actually was. By the third message, the framing shifted again. The Foundation had been under real pressure from donors that year. She'd been trying to protect something bigger than any one family member. She saw now how it must look. Deflection dressed carefully as accountability. Performing self-awareness without once landing on the actual admission of what she'd done or why she'd done it twice. She came to Beatrice's door that evening, which surprised us both. I watched from the hallway while Beatrice stood in the doorway and didn't let her past it. For a few seconds, something in Eleanor's face genuinely broke. Her voice cracked on my name, and she said, "I don't know how to look at what I did to Robert and know I was about to do it again." In a tone I had never heard from her in 8 years, raw in a way that didn't sound rehearsed. I believed that moment was real. I still do. Then Beatrice asked her one plain question: whether she'd told anyone on the board, before this meeting, about the pattern with Robert, or only after being caught with mine. And I watched the crack close almost as fast as it opened. Eleanor's posture straightened. Her voice found its familiar, composed register again. "That's not really productive to relitigate right now," she said. And the raw woman from moments earlier was gone, replaced by the version of Eleanor who always had a next sentence ready. Beatrice closed the door. Eleanor never once that evening, or in the weeks that followed, said the sentence that would have required her to stop protecting the system and admit she'd built it twice with full awareness over more than a decade. I kept waiting for the version of this where she finally said it plainly, without a qualifier, and it never came. Not that week, not in the board's follow-up session, not even once quietly when it was just the two of us with nothing left to protect by finally admitting it. I think some part of me needed to stop waiting for that sentence before I could actually move forward. And letting go of the waiting mattered more, in the end, than the sentence itself ever would have, even now, months later, when I still catch myself half expecting it. Justice in the end looked like paperwork. The board voted, within a month, to restore the original trust language, formally recognizing me and any future spouse on equal footing regardless of lineage, and to require independent legal review of any future governance change touching family composition. Eleanor stepped back from the board chair voluntarily, before anyone had to force the question, into an emeritus role with no real authority. I chose not to pursue anything beyond the foundation's internal process. No lawsuit, no public statement, because a public fight would have consumed a foundation that funds real, ongoing work I still believe in. And because the people who most needed protecting, going forward, were children in that family who hadn't been born yet. Those are the practical outcomes, and I can recite them cleanly. The other costs took longer to name. I lost the specific, easy version of belonging I genuinely believed I had in that family, the kind that assumes good faith by default. I don't have that anymore, and I grieve it the way you grieve something you didn't realize you were relying on until it was gone. I catch myself still reading warmth from that side of the family twice before I let myself simply enjoy it. I lost, too, some of my own certainty about my ability to read a room accurately, which had been the foundation of my entire professional identity. I'd read this room wrong. Or rather, I'd read it accurately and then talked myself out of trusting what I saw for years, because the alternative felt too enormous to hold at a Sunday dinner table. What I didn't lose? My marriage, which held in part because Marcus, once he saw the folder, never once asked me to make this smaller than it was. I didn't lose Beatrice, who chose in the weeks after that meeting to step back from her mother in a way that surprised even her. Not a full break, she told me, just enough distance to figure out what kind of grandmother she wanted her own mixed-race daughter to actually have. Some costs don't show up on any board resolution, and I've stopped expecting them to. Winning the concrete parts doesn't erase the softer bill underneath, and I've learned you pay that one slowly, in installments for longer than anyone warns you it will take. I think that's the part nobody tells you going into something like this, that even a clean, documented, fully justified win still leaves you standing in the wreckage of what you'd hoped, quietly, it wouldn't turn out to be true. I won. I want to say that plainly. I also don't feel the way I imagined winning would feel, and I've decided that's allowed to be true too.
My hands went cold once in this story, in a windowless records room holding a single photographed page, and they haven't gone cold like that since the afternoon the board vote was finalized. I signed the amended document. I drove home. I made a full pot of jollof rice that Sunday, the smell filling the whole downstairs the way it always has. And for the first time in longer than I want to admit, I didn't rehearse anything before Marcus's father sat down at our table. I still have the photograph of that first memo saved in a folder I'll probably never open again. And I've started to think of that as its own small, quiet ending. Even though nothing about closing a laptop folder involves fireworks or triumph. Some things you get back slowly, without ceremony, on an ordinary Sunday, when you least expect to notice you've gotten them back at all. Beatrice and I talk every week now.
more than we ever did before any of this. She's rebuilding something with her mother that looks nothing like what they had. Careful, partial, unresolved. The kind of relationship where she watches for the pattern now, instead of assuming good faith by default. I don't know if it'll hold. Neither does she. That uncertainty is more honest than any tidy reconciliation would have been. I kept my seat at that table, and I kept my name on the foundation's materials this time, printed correctly, spelled the way I've spelled it my entire life. Some mornings that still catches me off guard, in a way I'm learning to let be a good thing instead of only a hard one. I didn't get the version of this family I once believed I'd married into. What I got instead was proof that I could see clearly, act carefully, and still walk away with something worth keeping. My name, my marriage, my sister-in-law, and a kitchen table where these days nobody has to wonder whether they belong before they sit down. There's a printed copy of that original memo still in a folder in my home office. The only paper copy I ever made outside the formal audit file, and I use the same folder now to hold recipe cards I've been meaning to organize for years. I noticed myself doing that last month, sliding my grandmother's jollof recipe in behind a page that once rewrote 8 years of my own marriage. And I let myself feel, for a second, how strange and good it is that a folder can go back to being only a folder. Some things don't stay wounds forever. Some of them, eventually, get to hold something else instead.